Welcome to SAT Interviews. This week I sit down with Dakesh Patel, the CEO of ZimPay and CFO of Tingo. Now, he is a very interesting gentleman with a vast experience in investment. And we're going to delve into what his plans are and where he sees the continent going in as far as its investment projection is concerned. Dak, welcome.
Right, thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us today.
Pleasure to be here.
How do you do?
Very well.
Now, I know you've just flown in from South Africa.
I have.
And we're currently, of course, here in your offices in London. Thank you for having us again.
You're welcome.
Quick question, Dakesh. Now, I've personally known you for quite some time. And as far as, you having worked with, with your time in banking, and then, of course, your time in ZimPay, and now subsequently your time in Tingo. How does this journey begin?
Well, it began many years back. I mean, I grew up in Zimbabwe, as you know,
Yeah.
Educated in England, and then went into Deloitte's, qualified, and then went into banking. And it was when I was in banking that we started seeing the semblance of the challenge that communities in Africa face in particular, particularly in the areas of cross-border. And simple things like remittance, where typically Africa was paying a super tax compared to the rest of the world, just to move money. In South Africa, having been there for about 2 years now, the problem's even more acute, where the cost is significantly higher. And so you got, vast millions of people that have transacted or transported themselves across the border to work and live in South Africa, left part of their family at home, and then regularly send money home to support them. And so that was the semblance for starting a model like ZimPay, which was about how can you make ubiquitous payments a lot easier, frictionless, and allow people to be able to help their family at home.
Right.
And the birth of that was the marketplace, which is the Bill Marketplace that we launched initially in the UK. And it's been a painful journey because you go through lots of learnings and lots of experiences, and just simple things like paying for electricity, paying for school fees, sending money for groceries. It's a big area for us that we actually developed pretty well. And we see now a model where we can now take it to another level of scaling it, particularly focused on the diaspora that live in South Africa itself, which is very significant. So it's almost, the analogy is the Gulf region for South Asia, South Africa is to SADC in relation to that. But what was really stark is that over 90% of the market for the diaspora does the banking outside the system. And what I mean by that is using remittance houses to essentially send money home.
And these remittance houses, that money does not go into the national fiscus, does it?
It does go into the national fiscus because the money, goes across the border. People collect their cash. If you take Zimbabwe as an example, and so they typically.
But can a government plan against that money? Does it go directly to a reserve bank, perhaps, or just through consumption?
No, it's through consumption.
Okay.
So it's a market economy, and in the case of Zimbabwe, and if you look at the RBZ policies, that these are free funds.
Okay.
And so it's up to the individual how they want to actually utilize those funds, whether they bank them, whether they use it to pay bills, they go shopping, and so it does indirectly provide significant value to the economy.
Okay.
And that's true of not just Zimbabwe, but many countries where remittance forms a key part of the inflow of direct investment, as people would call it, as a substitute. In some countries like Zimbabwe, it's significantly higher than FDI that's going into the country. So it's very significant in terms of the people in that particular country. And so we've been very successful in proving how you can deliver real-time payments and supporting families in real time in that sort of sense. And that's the first phase of the journey that we went through. And what we're now doing is to actually take that to another level, which is about how do we offer that in the form of banking services? And how do we extend that to giving people effectively as close as we can to borderless banking through digital solutions in terms of what we do. So that's the phase that we're at in South Africa now. And last week I was pleased to say that we've launched through a regulated firm that we own, the service through an e-money account now. And we in the process of integrating bill payments to that, so you'll now be able to use a wallet both domestically and cross-border on the same application.
And so the marketplace will not just be South Africa. Does that also include Zimbabwe as well?
It will. It'll be Zimbabwe, and then we'll go into the region. So ultimately it'll cover the entire SADC market itself, and it gives people that ubiquity of dealing with their banking needs through a single application, through regulation that connects them cross-border as well as domestic.
And so far, what have been the successes of ZimPay?
Success has been the ubiquity, as I said, the simplicity, reduction in cost, convenience for the individual, and also control. To the extent that, you know, you hear stories where people have sent money home, it's not quite used for the reason it was sent in the first place. And so this gives them complete control, because when you say I'm paying for electricity, you're paying for electricity. When I'm paying school fees, you're paying school fees. So the school fee side of it even removes the need to go and prove to the bursar that you paid the fees, which is a common problem. At the beginning of each term, people stand in queues to prove they've made that specific payment, because we've automated that referencing into the bursar's bank accounts. And so they can actually see which child you paid for. So, you know, so the solutions we're looking at are ones where we actually solve not just the financial problem, but also the social problem that exists with it. And I think
the aspect of a trust deficit.
Yeah, the trust factor. But also I think through COVID, what we saw was that people are moving much more towards digital services, and e-commerce will be the next evolution, where people are comfortable ordering things to be delivered to them. And I think during the lockdown, people had that problem of saying, if I can't go out, I can't go shopping, then how am I going to get my goods? So in South Africa, for example, you know, the e-com side of retailing, Checkers 360 is an example, has become quite ubiquitous, that people have got used to the idea that I can just order and it gets delivered to my home. So it's taking the market towards digitization and use of digital platforms to now develop alternate banking systems and alternate payment systems. And that is moving towards what we believe in the midterm to be about lifestyle. And our role in society is to develop solutions within the banking framework that meet your lifestyle needs. Because in a few years' time, you will have the choice of action on how best you want to interact with the different merchants, the different providers. And it's that power that you'll have through your smart device means that we've got to be agile enough to deliver that type of service to you as a consumer.
So, and this is very interesting stuff. I mean, one of the questions that I have in light of that digital economy you're speaking of, which is, I think, is a great infrastructure to really close that gap when it comes to inequality aspect, is the cost of doing business on the digital platform. In Africa, we tend to find that you know, internet rates, for instance, are sky high. Are there any solutions to alleviate that as well?
Well, there are. You know, it depends on the convergence. So there are two aspects to that. One, which is saying, what's the actual cost of transacting in the first instance? And that's the point that we're addressing now in terms of what we do. And we've demonstrated how we can reduce that cost significantly down. Ultimately, you want it to be a zero-cost banking service. You know, much like the UK, where we don't pay for consumer banking, in a lot of countries in Africa, you actually do pay for consumer banking. So, you know, so that's one of the financial metrics that we want to solve through the way in which we deliver technical solutions and commercial solutions that address that. The data point is a function of the country itself, and you know, and people don't understand that if you take Zimbabwe as an example, or even Malawi for that matter, and even Chad, the conversation I had just the other week with some of the government officials there, is that it's a function of the size of the population. The smaller the population, you know, the infrastructure cost of providing telecommunications is the same. And therefore, your unit cost recovery is going to be higher where you've got lower populations. And so the economics are, it's not that we're paying a lot of money, and people keep blaming the telecom companies for charging higher rates in Zim, by example, on data. But that's a function of the investment they've got to make. And being in telco, you know, if you talk to MTN as well, it's a highly intensive CapEx business. You've got to keep investing in the infrastructure, and our demands on data traffic are increasing. They're not getting smaller. Whether we use it for social media, we use it for day-to-day activity, means that our demand for data traffic is going to be much higher.
But even South Africa has high costs as well, but they have a relatively higher population.
They do, but relative to its neighboring countries, it's a lot lower.
Yeah.
You know, because it's got a slightly bigger population. There you've got possibly up to 50, 60 million people that access that. And it gets even cheaper when you go to Nigeria. You know, you got 250 million people, and certainly the cost of data drops because the unit cost in terms of the infrastructure is going to drop.
Perhaps African governments need to have a regional outlook, a regional look at the investment in terms of the infrastructure for technology.
They can, yeah. But that then goes back to what's the role of the telco themselves. And I think the solution will come from the convergence. So it's not so much the infrastructure. That's the wrong end of the pencil to look at. Where we need to sharpen the pencil is looking at the congruence of what is the service the individual wants, and what is it that you want out of that data pipe, as I call it, if you like. So you got a triangulation. You could take a typical example. You got the telco that provides the service. You got the retailer that sells you what you need, and then you've got the banking or the fintech that's actually doing the payment management in that particular ecosystem. So the ideal model is one that's saying, how do I bring those components into a single application? Which is, if you look at China, the WeChat model, having the super app means that all of your lifestyle is in a single application. And if you bring it to a single application, you can drive the economies down, because you can start substituting value and you can start subsidizing it. So you're paying people.
So amalgamating the WhatsApps, the Facebooks, and all these things into one thing.
Into one application.
One application.
Correct.
That's localized.
Correct.
That meets that local
need. It meets that need, and it means that you get rewarded for the transaction flow that you spend on. So if you bought electricity, you paid for groceries on there, you sent a gift or whatever, all these things drive transactional income.
So which basically advocates for local solutions and local apps, as it were.
It does. And in a lot of places you call it reverse billing. So there are people that have, reverse billing apps. If you take a banking app, it's a good example. How often do we actually open up our mobile phones with a banking app? But it's hogging up data, hogging up memory. And you only open that app when you want to make a transaction or you want to check something.
Yeah.
Other times you're not using it. So as a financial institution, for us, it's saying, how do I empower you to keep hitting that app? And if you wanted social media, maybe I incorporate it within that app itself. So I'm giving you multiple products and services within the same data pipe. And there where you're getting value, because every time you transact, I'm rewarding you back in the form of data, as an example.
Exactly.
So I can reduce that cost. So that's the kind of innovation that is coming, and that's at the forefront of what we're doing now, is that how do we integrate your lifestyle solutions to then make that cost of having that data pipe on your smartphone even cheaper. And that comes from cross-subsidizing transaction flow income into that particular service itself.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. I think where the challenge would be is sort of getting people to not only just be attracted to local solutions in as far as in comparison to your Facebook or your WhatsApp, but more so to use those.
Yeah.
But you seeing the financial incentive in that.
Correct.
Where the value is.
Correct.
I think there'll need to be a lot of sort of culture education around that, isn't it? But I do get that, and I think China presents a good model, and India as well. They tend to have their own localized solutions, and Africa should have the same. And I'm glad that you say that something is coming. So I anticipate to see
well, it's there already. I mean, if we talked a bit about Tingo, and I joined Tingo's board last year.
Yeah.
And for me, Tingo is a phenomenal example.
Okay.
And an
tell us more about
business.
Tingo. So we know Tingo is a $1 billion entity in Agritech. It's doing a lot of work in Nigeria. Speak more precisely specific to your work and what drew you to the entity itself.
Yeah. So what drew me there was about social impact. Okay. It was all about upliftment, and that's part of the ethos of what I believe in. When we set up ZimPay, and what we're doing in banking services was about bringing that ubiquity, bringing that inclusion, but more importantly, how do you drive better behavior to drive efficiency in a particular market? And one of the biggest things in Africa is land and agriculture. Yeah. It's at the bedrock of every nation. And I think the problem in Ukraine has brought that acute problem home, that food security has become of prominent importance.
Okay.
And so Africa needs to solve its own food security problems. In fact, we've got 60% arable land, but we still import food produce into Africa. That's the problem we need to solve. And that's where Tingo, I see, as being that next dimension. So it's Africa's leading agri-fintech platform. And the way that business operated was that initial stages when it was formed by Dozie Mbozi, who's the founder of Tingo. We're about to merge with a company on the NASDAQ, MICT, and that's progressing really well. And that'll then give us the ability to come into a public market to be able to drive further investment and growth. So what is Tingo? So Tingo, a number of years ago, set up with a study in rural Nigeria to work out that the rural communities, particularly the farmers, were suffering post-harvest loss of about 60-odd%, which meant that they didn't have the means to get their produce to market on time. And the simple solution to that was to give everyone a smartphone. and enable them to start communicating in the first instance. So just basic airtime and data within that. But we did that by leasing the phones over 3 years. So it made it affordable.
Okay.
And we're now in the third 3-year cycle where we've got 9.3 million customers that effectively lease that phone. In January 2020, we developed Nawasa, which is the Agri-Fintech marketplace platform. And that meant that through the phone now, you could transact your produce. And by linking with the supply chain, logistics, and buyers on the other side, we got upward of 5 million farmers now that trade their produce. So we do about $500 million worth of produce trading a month in Nigeria. But that's come from the simplicity of saying, if you have a smartphone and we give you access to the marketplace, we're now empowering rural farmers to start connecting their product that can be sold directly. In addition to that, you can pay for utilities, get insurance, get access to phone loans if you need that, and then we look to add other services.
So is the market, is that local market in Nigeria, or is it regional, continental?
Initially, it's Nigeria itself, and our objective is to roll that out across Africa, essentially. So it's combining a lot of the experience of what we've done in ZimPay and extending that across Africa, but bringing the power of Tingo on the agricultural side and its expertise.
And is the future then to also expand to the European markets, looking at the global South markets and global North markets, in as far as the agricultural output is concerned?
I think as an output, yes, but as an input, or do we want to play in those particular markets? Then it's a bit early.
Okay.
I think for us, it's about, as I said, how do we solve the Pan-Africa problem?
Okay. And
with the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, with PAPS that AfriExim Bank launched in terms of interoperability on payments in Africa, it's the right moment to take Tingo to become effectively the clearinghouse for agriculture. So there's no reason why intra-country, between countries, they can't be trading produce that may be grown in one country that's needed in another. For example, Nigeria is a huge producer of cassava. Cassava is the absolute raw material that goes into noodle manufacture. Right. So noodle is another way in which you can actually feed. Then you got maize, you got wheat, you got groundnuts. Groundnuts go into peanut butter. So it's all about identifying what are those connectivities between different countries in Africa, and how can you actually intertrade within itself, or how can you create the opportunity.
This is very interesting, because I think one of the challenges that we have in Africa is that a lot of our trade is, I'm sure if you recall the words of Julius Nyerere when he argued that, Africa trading with Africa is less than 15%. And he said it way back then in the 60s,
exactly.
And it still remains the same
till
today.
Correct.
And I think, so answering that question creates a competition. So that when we're looking at, FDI inflow, we can actually look at it in contrast to our local continental trade. So I think that's fantastic work. So tell me, so far, what have been the major successes of Tingo?
Major successes are essentially is that we've empowered over 10 million farmers now that have direct access to their buy point. We've allowed them to effectively get better value for their produce itself. There are more women that are employed in agriculture than any other sector. And so having them participate as agents in that ecosystem meant that you're creating new forms of income source for them. And then, as I said, as we reduce that post-harvest loss from 60, we haven't measured that fully, but we understand that we're making an impact because more produce is beginning to trade. And as we reduce that post-harvest loss, if you take the lowest farmer in the value chain, that 10% reduction, even from 60 to 50%, could mean doubling their income. So it has huge impact.
So another thing I wanted to find out, so from Tingo, can the farmer also get their inputs there?
We are working through that. That's the next phase of where we're taking Nawasa and developing that. So we're merging Tingo Pay, which we're launching, which is a wallet service with Visa, and then the Nawasa platform itself, which is the agri marketplace. And by merging that, some of the elements we'll add on to that will be the seed purchase, the inputs, fertilizer. We've got agronomy solutions that we want to bring in. So it's not just about the purchase, it's also then about the advice. Right. And how do we then enable farmers to get better advice from us having field agents that go out and test the soil, they test the inputs, they test the grading of your produce as it's going through its growing season, and then give you advice on remediation so that we can predict better productivity.
That's really good. And then another aspect that I want to find out is, so from a Tingo perspective, now I understand it helps in terms of getting access to market. How about the logistics of that market, considering perhaps a lot of these areas are predominantly rural? What's the connectivity there?
No, that's a good question. So we've partnered with companies that really have warehousing capacity where you can take your produce to. We've arranged with a partner as well the logistics of that. So you either bring it to a particular warehouse and then from there you get distributed to the end buyer that's purchasing that. And that's been very successful in what we operate. And as I said, right now we trade $500 million equivalent a month. And that's a significant flow of produce, by any stretch of the imagination. So that's the area that we want to work further and deeper in relation to finding infrastructure partners that can develop that even further. Particularly the cool chain is a good example. So your fresh produce can get there. Other areas that we're exploring with related businesses within the group is looking at downstream processing. So if you take tomatoes, then why not put in a tomato processing plant for canning, for passata, etc. So those are innovations that are coming as part of that.
And Tingo will be sort of spearheading that.
Tingo will be part of that whole ecosystem. But the point I'm making is that by having this foundation and this layer of helping transparently through use of a smartphone, those farmers, you're enabling those other services to plug in to the ecosystem that we've built already and are looking to expand even further and enhance through further technology.
This is all great stuff. So what's the future looking like in terms of ZimPay and Tingo, but more so for you personally?
Well, I think for me, it's a journey. It's a very exciting journey, and it's having come from Africa, I'm now going back to Africa to saying everything I've learned, all the experience I've gained from being a global executive. How do we give back? How do we bring some of these experiences and solutions? And joining hands with Dozie at Tingo is part of that evolution because it has a huge impact on society. It has a huge impact on the ordinary people that basically just want to make a living. And the other side with ZimPay, bringing the financial services side to its maturity that we plan to over the next 3 to 5 years on a combined basis is a very powerful proposition of transforming Africa in a way that should have happened quite some time back. But it does take pioneers like my colleagues at Tingo. It takes the pain of what we've been through in developing ZimPay to then take that to the next level. It needs good investment itself, and so we will announce further investment going into that particular space of what we want to do. So for me personally, working with the team that we've got, we're all very passionate about that model of ubiquity, about inclusion and upliftment, and particularly developing women in Africa. Those are the things that resonate with me in particular, and they resonate with the team that we've assembled. So that's a very exciting next to three to 5 years ahead for us.
Within the context of it being Women's Month in South Africa, I think it's a great way to close the interview by that fact that you're doing a lot of work in supporting not only the community at large in Africa, but also women. I suppose before you go, what is the role of the diaspora in your mind?
The role of the diaspora is very important. For one, they're ambassadors of their country in wherever they're living, right? So I've made UK my home for many, many years, if you like. So we represent the country we come from. And, in Zimbabwe, it's got a lot of challenges in terms of how the world sees it. But the one gift it's given to the world is the value of its education and the experience. And if you look around the world, then very successful management of people have come from that little nation. And even in South Africa, when you're there, if you look at the services industry, the eloquence of even the most simplest person working, a waiting staff, a hotel staff, you can tell they're from Zimbabwe. It's that pride of that education that you're taking away. So as diaspora, you represent your nation in wherever you're working and living, and you're part of that contribution to society in wherever you're living. But the more important element is that you have got a role to play in the development of your home country as well. So you're channeling part of your hard-earned earnings back home. Whether you're building a home, you're helping your parents or your family with healthcare, etc. That's the richness of being a diaspora, that you don't forget your roots, but you adapt to the market and the model of where you're living. And that's the real role of the diaspora. They are effectively the true ambassadors.
And what are you reading?
What am I reading? I read philosophy, so the Vedanta philosophy. So a lot of it was about self-development, and it's also about, what's the model for serving, and so it's learning that element of it, and so that's what I'm reading at the moment. And then occasionally I'll read some non-fiction. I read a book when I was in South Africa to understand South African model. It was called the Stellenbosch Mafia, and it's a fascinating read. It's an amazing book that just explains how the country's evolved to what it is today and beyond. Yeah, so it's, some of it. I like non-fiction.
Yeah.
When it comes to fiction, it's Dan Brown. I've just finished Origins. Interesting book. Yeah.
That's good. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Dak. And I truly am humbled and appreciate your time. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us on this week's episode of SAT Interviews with your host, Farai Mafuti. Make sure you join us next week. And don't forget, like, subscribe, and share. Take care.
Introducing Sawi, the chatbot from Nyaradzo. Speak to Sawi for all your queries and inquiries. The benefits of having Sawi by your side are endless. When you need to know about our policy, Nyaradzo products, payment platforms, claims, the Sawira International Plan, where to find the Nyaradzo branches, Nyaradzo contact details, how to apply, and any questions you may have. And she can help you find who you want to speak to. For your convenience, you can ask about anything, from our funeral services, counseling to your payments, and much more. Experience the benefit of having Sawi by your side. App Sawi today on WhatsApp number 0712 992 892. Nyaradzo, Sawira Mukuru, Omgane Omkulu.